And thank you, everybody, for joining me on this episode of Coming Home with John Allen. Now, today is going to be part 2 in the Masculinity Series. Before we get to that, I want to remind everybody that if you look at the description of this episode, whether you're viewing this on a video on YouTube or listening on a podcast platform, go to the description of this episode and you'll see a couple of links where you can click in if you would like to support the work I'm doing. All support that you give goes towards production of Coming Home with John Allen, and I thank you all very much for that. Enjoy the conversation. This is the Coming Home Podcast with John Allen. And joining us now for this segment on our discussion about the state of masculinity in our society, we have Mr. Robert Gray. Robert Gray is an associate professor at the University of Bergen here in Norway. Rob, thank you for being here. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Listen, I don't want to pretend that you or I speak for all men, but we do have our thoughts. We do have our opinions. Let me ask you this. What is the state of masculinity in our society? I guess I mean our Western society. What is the state of masculinity? Is it under attack? And what is your definition of toxic masculinity? What do you have to say?
I mean, those are excellent, difficult questions.
They are. That's what we're here for. We want to tackle the hard stuff.
I don't really know how to come at the first question of what is the state of masculinity these days. Whether it's under attack, that's a more interesting question, but it's also a complicated question. And that, masculinity is one that's socially constructed. What makes something masculine or feminine? There's always this sort of we tend to think in a very binary way that something is masculine or feminine, and there's really nothing that is utterly masculine or utterly feminine. That everything is on a continuum between those things, and maybe mostly on different axes altogether. But there are, in Western society, as you framed what you mean by our society, we have these traditional values that we associate with masculinity and femininity, and there has been in recent years sort of talk about this toxic masculinity. And anytime something gets labeled like that, it becomes a problem. I mean, it sort of reminds me of the defund the police thing, where
messaging is important. Yes,
and it's always bad when things are important. Defunding the police, I don't think is a bad idea, but it's a really bad name.
Yeah,
and the same thing is true, I think, with white supremacy is another phrase that had a meaning back in the 40s and 50s, and the meaning that we say when we say white supremacy now, we don't really mean that same thing. And toxic masculinity is another.
Yeah, what is toxic masculinity? There's so many definitions.
Well, we have this. I mean, part of it is it's sort of embedded in the definition of what is masculinity. Yeah. What does it mean to be a man? What are qualities that we associate that men have that are supposed to have? And a lot of it has to do with being tough and not showing weakness and being in control and being dominant. And
dominant. There's a key word.
Being above women and sort of being misogynistic even, and being homophobic or at least anti homosexuals or transgender or anything like that. And so we and where it becomes a problem is when those things become a problem. And
well said.
they're not they're not inherently bad. I mean, I would say that the homophobia and the
dominating,
misogyny are, and being dominant and assuming because you're the male, you're in control. And when you're sitting around the table with a mixed group of people or a mostly female group, and you sort of symbolically plop your dick out on the table and say, I'm in control and this is the way things are, and you're automatically authority in a dominating way. That's a nicer definition of toxic masculinity.
Well, and that's the type of masculinity that not only makes the guy who practices that type of toxic masculinity, it doesn't just make him look like an asshole, but it also can lead to trauma on the rest of the family, the wife and kids. That type of domineering, totalitarian attitude that some men have within the four walls of their home causes lifelong damage on their children and trauma and lifelong damage on their wives.
And I mean, physically and psychologically.
Absolutely.
And
definitely
also,
toxic.
And where this has become sort of in the academic discussion, and this is not my field, I should have said that to start, but it leads to physical and psychological issues in the male himself because you have this pressure to live up to this artificial ideal that is inherently unhealthy anyway, and so it leads to this depression issues. It leads to stress, which leads to all sorts of physiological problems.
This discussion, I just want to jump in here. This discussion about masculinity is becoming more and more common. Some men feel attacked by this discussion. The guy who has some of the traits that, for example, women would define as toxic masculinity, he defies just as being masculine, so that when that toxic word comes into it and the discussion follows, it's making a lot of men feel as if their masculinity or they themselves personally are under attack. What do you say to that? What are your observations when it comes to that?
Oh, Lord.
We see it online.
Started on that. I think it has to do with, that's almost like calling people snowflakes. There's almost nobody more snowflakey than somebody who calls somebody else a snowflake. There's almost nothing less masculine than whining about being called toxically masculine. Yeah. Because you're showing an insecurity. And a lot of this, gets back to your first question. What is the state of masculinity? For 2,500 years, Western civilization sort of rolled along where white men were in control of everything.
Yeah. And it's relatively recent that has been challenged in a meaningful way. Within
the last 140 years, but really meaningfully the last 50 years, women have kind of become not equal, but at least more equal. Yeah. And then probably more recently than that even, people of color have sort of finally in our society taken on, sort of humanity rather than sort of, chattel kind of characteristics. And for white males who have spent their whole life and their whole, history being in charge, and the idea of that being challenged, that's traumatizing, or in a way. I mean, and to, me, I'm going to pull everything back to race a lot of times, but, a lot of what Trumpism is about after we had a black president, it's reclaiming America for the white man. Yeah. And, that's what a lot of the political discourse now is about. Mitch McConnell the other day said African Americans vote at the same rate as Americans do.
How about that? Yeah.
And, there's this sense of men are losing their power. And I'm not even sure what that means, really.
I think in practical terms, and the reality of the situation is that the playing field is becoming more level, and some men don't like it.
Yeah, their privilege is being withered away. The privilege that they deny that they have
But does loss of
when that's taken
privilege?
away,
But does loss of privilege? And I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just a little bit short on time. But does loss of privilege equate loss of power?
I don't know. It shouldn't. I mean,
because losing the privilege, in other words, leveling the playing field, doesn't make you or I any less of a man. In my head, and I'm sure in your head as well. But again, there is that segment of society, mostly older, middle-aged white men, who feel that that is a very direct attack on their very essence.
Well, and that gets into issues of insecurity and weakness that they have to shield with this false bravado of masculinity, and that's when it becomes toxic. There's so many things I'm trying to say and can't say all in the limited amount of time, but in America, like the big pickup trucks these days that people have, is that part of toxic masculinity? I made a joke coming out of a bar one day where I saw a guy get into one of these, and I was like, those are interesting penis enhancement devices.
And it can be that for very many men, things like the big pickup truck could be a crutch. But I'm very careful about labeling people, and I'm not saying you're labeling these people as men in need of a crutch. But I'm very careful about that because I'm a 300-pound world-class power lifter, and a lot of women will look at me and think misogynist, low intelligence, insecure, which the crutch of a domineering personality will try to build up that insecurity. They'll look at me and they'll put me in that box immediately. I'm real short on time. I want a pickup truck myself. I don't have any manhood issues, but I love pickup trucks. But I understand your point.
Nothing wrong with pickup trucks.
No, there isn't.
Nothing really wrong with big ones, but why are they getting so big?
You're right. Yeah.
In this moment when manhood is being challenged as the dominant. Yeah. But one point I do want to make before we go is that the people who are complaining about this also complain about characterization of things as groups. Yes. They think everything should be individualized and treated individually. And yet, as an individual, when I'm in any situation where power is involved or not, I never feel like I'm in competition with women or with black people.
Right.
I might feel like I'm in competition with a woman or a man or an African-American man or whatever.
And there's a distinction. Yes. Yeah.
But it's not like as a man, I'm in competition with womanhood in this situation. Yeah. And so I think that's an important thing. That,
I think it is
because there's such thing as toxic masculinity, that does not mean that all men are bad. Just because there's a thing called racism, that doesn't mean all white people are bad.
Right.
It's when you are using your masculinity to an extreme that causes harm to others unnecessarily or necessarily for nefarious reasons. Yeah. Because if you are, by exercising your masculinity, you're harming other people, there's no good in that, and that there's no defending that. And so it's toxic.
Very well said. This is Rob Gray, everybody. He's a long-distance friend of mine. I enjoy talking with you, Rob. You always have good things to say, things that make me think. I'm sure you're making my viewers and listeners think as well. Thank you for talking with me about masculinity. Rob Gray, everybody. Thank you so much, Rob, for your contribution in this segment. Stick around for 1 second.
Thank you.
I'd like to talk to you on the other side.